Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you grateful for modern beauty standards. No matter how impossible they seem today, we're diving deep into the brutal, bizarre, and often deadly world of medieval beauty ideals. Standards so extreme they could literally destroy you from the inside out. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, looking pale wasn't a sign that you needed more sleep or a vacation in the sun. It was the ultimate fashion statement, a social flex. A silent announcement to the world that said, I am too rich and too important to ever see daylight. Thank you very much. Unlike today, where a healthy glow might suggest yoga classes, smoothie bowls, or a recent trip to somewhere with actual sunshine, medieval beauty flipped the script entirely. Tan skin meant you worked outside, which meant you were poor, which meant gasp, manual labor. And nothing said not beautiful in the 14th century, quite like knowing how to milk a cow or harvest grain with your own two hands. So the paler you were, the higher your perceived status. And when we say pale, we don't mean a soft ivory glow that suggests good genetics and expensive skincare. We're talking translucent porcelain white skin with visible blue veins. Skin so light it looked like you might have been recently startled by a ghost. Or perhaps were a ghost yourself. Of course, nature doesn't always cooperate with beauty standards, especially if you were born with an actual working circulatory system that pumped blood through your body like it was supposed to. So, people helped nature along, and by helped, I mean they slowly poisoned themselves in the name of fashion. Noble women and even some men occasionally would apply white lead powder to their faces. Yes, lead. The same substance we now know causes brain damage, organ failure, and death, but it provided that signature corpse chic glow that medieval society craved. And as a bonus, it slowly killed you. But hey, beauty has always had its price. Right, the application process was an art form in itself. Women would mix white lead powder with vinegar or egg whites to create a paste that could be smoothed over the face, neck, and sometimes the entire visible body. The result was a smooth matte finish that made the skin look flawless and ethereally pale. The medieval equivalent of high-definition foundation if high-definition foundation could cause your hair to fall out and your teeth to rot. Some would use vinegar-soaked cloths to bleach their skin, lying in the sun with acidic rags pressed against their faces, essentially giving themselves chemical burns in the pursuit of paleness. Others applied mixtures of crushed pearls and egg whites, which not only lightened the face, but also had the delightful side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale omelette. The truly dedicated would even paint veins onto their arms and chest using blue pigment, simulating the delicate translucent quality that suggested noble blood flowing just beneath paper-thin skin. Because nothing said aristocratic quite like looking like your skin might split open at any moment. Even literature got in on the pale obsession. Romantic poems described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and once memorably like the moon in winter, which is a poetic way of saying she looked like she might faint if someone spoke to her too loudly. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about beauty standards. It was shorthand for class, purity, and complete economic disengagement with anything resembling actual work. If you could afford to be fragile, delicate, and seemingly on the verge of collapse, you were winning at medieval life. The irony, of course, was that achieving this deathly pale look often led to actual death. Lead poisoning caused a host of symptoms that medieval people probably thought were just the natural consequences of being fashionably beautiful. Chronic fatigue, hair loss, skin ulcers, digestive problems, and eventually organ failure. But the fashion endured because the alternative, being mistaken for a peasant, was considered far worse than slowly dying from cosmetic poisoning. Better to be a beautiful corpse than a healthy commoner. Or so the thinking went. Women would start this deadly beauty routine as young as 12 or 13. Meaning they spent their entire adult lives slowly accumulating toxic metals in their bloodstream. By the time they reached their 20s, many had developed the telltale signs of lead poisoning: a grayish pallor, which they'd probably thought was just really good makeup, tremors in their hands, and a tendency to become violently ill after eating. The wealthy could afford the good lead powder, finely ground, mixed with expensive oils, sometimes even imported from distant lands. The poor, when they tried to emulate this look, often used crudder mixtures that were even more dangerous. Chalk dust mixed with flour, or worse, actual house paint scraped from walls. Servants in noble households were often tasked with applying their mistress's makeup. And many of them suffered from secondary lead poisoning just from handling the cosmetics day after day. It was an occupational hazard that no one understood or acknowledged. They just knew that ladies' maids had a tendency to develop mysterious illnesses and die young. The application ritual itself was elaborate and time-consuming. A proper lady would spend hours each morning having her face painted. Starting with a base layer of lead powder, then adding highlights and shadows with different shades of white and gray. The goal was to look like a living marble statue. Beautiful, perfect, and utterly lifeless. And it wasn't just the face. Arms, necks, and any visible skin had to match. Some women even powdered their hair white or wore elaborate white wigs to complete the ghostly effect. The overall look was supposed to suggest someone so refined, so elevated above common humanity that they barely seemed to exist in the physical world at all. Men weren't entirely immune to this trend either. Male courtiers, especially in the later medieval period and early Renaissance, sometimes used lighter powders or skin treatments to achieve a more refined appearance. After all, if you were spending your days in the company of kings and queens, you couldn't afford to look like you'd ever done anything as vulgar as work for a living. The pale beauty standard also had religious undertones. In a Christian society, pale skin was associated with purity, virginity, and spiritual elevation. Dark skin, whether from sun exposure or natural pigmentation, was often linked with sin, earthiness, and moral corruption. So achieving the perfect pale complexion wasn't just about fashion. It was about demonstrating your spiritual worthiness. This created a vicious cycle where the pursuit of beauty became literally toxic. But the social pressure to maintain appearances was so intense that people continued poisoning themselves rather than risk being seen as common or impure. It was a beauty standard that demanded not just sacrifice but potentially the ultimate sacrifice: your life. The most tragic part was that many women probably never connected their declining health with their beauty routine. In an age where medical knowledge was limited and life expectancy was already short, the symptoms of lead poisoning might have been attributed to everything from bad humors to divine punishment for vanity. The very thing they thought was making them more beautiful was slowly destroying them from within. And yet, portraits from the period show us exactly what this look was supposed to achieve. Pale, ethereal faces that seem to glow with an otherworldly light. Skin so perfect it looks almost artificial. These women achieved the beauty standard of their time. They just paid for it with their health, their sanity, and often their lives. Of all the medieval beauty trends that would make modern people scratch their heads in confusion, the obsession with high foreheads might be the most literally eyebrow-raising. And I say literally because people were removing their eyebrows to achieve it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just fashionable in medieval Europe. It was considered elegant, intelligent, and divine. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face. A vast expanse of pale skin that suggested you spent your days reading psalms and gazing pensively out of castle windows, not wielding a shovel or chasing chickens around a farmyard. The ideal forehead was supposed to dominate the face, creating a dome-like effect that made you look like you had been blessed with superior intelligence and noble breeding. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a five-head. Except instead of being mocked for it, you were praised as the epitome of beauty and refinement. To achieve this noble look, Women went to extreme and frankly uncomfortable measures. Eyebrows were plucked out completely. Hair by painful hair, often using crude tweezers made from whatever metal could be shaped into a pinching tool. But it didn't stop there. The hairline itself was systematically moved backward, inch by agonizing inch, to create more forehead real estate. This wasn't a simple trim or a subtle adjustment. This was a full-on forehead expansion project that would make modern plastic surgeons WSE. Women would spend hours plucking not just their eyebrows, but the hair along their temples and the front of their scalp, gradually pushing their hairline back until their forehead resembled a vast pale prairie. Medieval grooming manuals, yes, they existed, advised women to use a variety of methods to achieve this look. Hot cloths soaked in various solutions were pressed against the hairline to weaken the hair follicles. Depilly creams made from ingredients that would horrify modern chemists were smeared along the forehead and left to burn away unwanted hair. Some of these hair removal concoctions included quicklime, which is essentially the same stuff used to dissolve bodies in crime dramas. Others contained arsenic, mercury, or acids derived from various plants and minerals. The idea was to chemically burn the hair away at the root, hopefully without doing too much damage to the skin underneath. Spoiler alert, there was usually quite a bit of damage to the skin underneath. For the truly dedicated, there were also mechanical methods. Some women used heated metal tools to singe away hair, essentially giving themselves controlled burns in the name of beauty. Others employed abrasive stones or rough cloths to literally scrape the hair away, leaving their foreheads raw and bleeding but satisfyingly hair-free. The process was not only painful but dangerous. Many women developed serious infections from the crude hair removal methods and some suffered permanent scarring or disfigurement. But the social pressure to achieve the perfect high forehead was so intense that these risks were considered acceptable. The results, when successful, were striking. Portraits from the period show women with foreheads so vast and smooth they could have hosted a small dinner party. Combined with the fashionable pale skin we discussed earlier, these women looked like they had been carved from marble by a sculptor who had very specific ideas about cranial proportions. The high forehead trend wasn't limited to just removing hair. It also influenced fashion and accessories. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and hennons. Those famous cone-shaped hats were all designed to emphasize and frame the expanded forehead. The more forehead you could display, the more fashionable you were considered. Some women who couldn't achieve the perfect natural high forehead through hair removal would fake it using makeup and strategic head coverings. They would draw their hairline high using light-colored powders or paints, then cover the rest of their hair with elaborate headdresses that created the illusion of a towering forehead. This trend wasn't just some isolated castle fashion. It spread across Europe like wildfire. From England to France to Italy, noble women were enthusiastically removing their eyebrows and hairlines in pursuit of the perfect dome-shaped head. Artists and poets reinforced the trend by consistently praising women whose faces seemed to begin somewhere near the crown of their heads. The obsession with high foreheads also had intellectual implications. A large forehead was associated with intelligence and wisdom, the idea being that a bigger forehead meant a bigger brain and therefore superior mental capacity. This was of course complete nonsense from a medical standpoint, but it gave the beauty trend a pseudo-scientific justification that made it seem more legitimate. Men weren't entirely exempt from this trend either. While they rarely went to the same extremes as women, male courtiers sometimes trimmed or shaped their hairlines to achieve a more refined intellectual appearance. A slightly receding hairline was actually considered distinguished and attractive, suggesting a man of learning and contemplation. The high forehead obsession also intersected with religious beliefs. In Christian art, angels and saints were often depicted with high, smooth foreheads, suggesting spiritual purity and divine wisdom. By emulating this look, medieval women were essentially trying to make themselves appear more angelic and holy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this beauty trend was how it affected young girls. Mothers would begin plucking their daughters' eyebrows and hairlines as early as age 10 or 12, starting the painful process of forehead expansion before the girls were old enough to understand what was being done to them. By the time these girls reached adulthood, they had spent years enduring regular hair removal sessions that left them scarred, infected, and sometimes permanently disfigured. The tools used for this process were primitive and often unsanitary. Tweezers were shared between family members, spreading infections and diseases. The depilatory creams were mixed in unsanitary conditions and often contained unknown contaminants that caused additional health problems. Some women became so obsessed with achieving the perfect forehead that they continued plucking and burning away hair even after they had achieved the desired look, unable to stop the compulsive behavior. This led to permanent baldness, severe scarring, and in some cases infections that spread to the brain and caused death. The economic impact of this beauty trend was also significant. The tools, creams, and treatments required to maintain a high forehead were expensive, creating a thriving industry of beauty specialists who catered to wealthy women's forehead expansion needs. Poor women who couldn't afford professional treatments often resorted to dangerous home remedies that were even more likely to cause injury or death. Despite all these risks and costs, the high forehead remained the beauty ideal for several centuries. It wasn't until the Renaissance brought new ideas about natural beauty and classical proportions that the trend began to fade. But even then, it took generations for eyebrows to come back into fashion, and many women continued to maintain artificially high hairlines well into the 16th century. Looking back at portraits from this period, it's hard to understand how anyone thought these dramatically altered faces looked natural or attractive. But beauty standards are always a product of their time and culture. And in medieval Europe, a forehead that could double as a landing strip was the height of feminine beauty and sophistication. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just underappreciated, they were actively eliminated. While modern beauty trends celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and TikTok tutorials on eyebrow shaping, the 14th and 15th centuries declared war on facial hair above the eyes. Eyebrows were seen as unnecessary facial clutter, stubborn weeds growing in the garden of the face. To achieve the ideal medieval look, women didn't just trim or shape their eyebrows, they obliterated them entirely. This wasn't a case of overplucking or an unfortunate waxing accident. This was deliberate, systematic eyebrow genocide carried out with the dedication of someone performing a sacred ritual. The reasoning behind this follicular massacre was tied to the high forehead obsession we discussed earlier. A bare, smooth forehead was considered elegant and refined, and any sign of actual hair growth interrupted the aesthetic. Eyebrows were basically seen as nature's mistake, an evolutionary oversight that needed to be corrected through painful and persistent grooming. The methods used to achieve eyebrow extinction were as varied as they were horrifying. The most common approach was simple plucking. Women would spend hours with crude tweezers pulling out every single eyebrow hair one by one. But this was just the beginning of the torture. For those who wanted more permanent results, there were chemical solutions. Women would apply mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or arsenic to their eyebrow area, essentially giving themselves chemical burns to prevent hair regrowth. The pain was excruciating, the scarring was permanent, and the risk of blindness was very real. But the results were undeniably effective. Some women took even more extreme measures, using hot coals or heated metal tools to burn away their eyebrows at the root. This process, known as cauterization, was borrowed from medical procedures and adapted for cosmetic use. The smell of burning hair and flesh was apparently considered a small price to pay for the perfect smooth forehead. The most dedicated followers of this trend would shave their entire eyebrow area with sharp knives or razors. Then apply various substances to prevent regrowth. These substances often included toxic metals, plant extracts, and animal products that caused severe skin reactions and sometimes permanent damage to the hair follicles. The result of all this effort was a face that looked distinctly alien by modern standards. Without eyebrows to frame the eyes and provide expression, Medieval women's faces had an eerie mask-like quality. Their eyes appeared larger and more prominent, but also strangely expressionless, like beautiful dolls that had been crafted by someone who had never seen a real human face. The lack of eyebrows also had practical consequences that medieval women probably didn't anticipate. Eyebrows serve an important biological function. They help keep sweat, rain, and debris out of the eyes. Without this natural protection, women found themselves constantly blinking, squinting, and suffering from eye irritation. But apparently, functional vision was less important than achieving the perfect aesthetic. The eyebrow removal process wasn't a one-time event. It required constant maintenance. Hair would try to grow back and women had to repeatedly pluck, burn, or chemically treat their brow area to maintain the smooth look. This meant that many women spent a significant portion of their time and energy on eyebrow maintenance, turning what should have been a simple grooming routine into a part-time job. The tools used for eyebrow removal were primitive and often dangerous. Tweezers were made from whatever metal could be shaped into a pinching tool. Sometimes iron, sometimes bronze, often poorly crafted and likely to break or slip during use. The risk of injury was constant, and many women bore permanent scars from tweezers that had gouged their skin or from chemical treatments that had gone wrong. Some women employed servants to help with the eyebrow removal process. But this created its own problems. Servants who were tasked with plucking their mistress's eyebrows often suffered from repetitive strain injuries in their hands and wrists. They were also exposed to the toxic chemicals used in depilatory treatments, leading to health problems that were rarely acknowledged or treated. The psychological impact of constant eyebrow removal was also significant. Many women developed obsessive behaviors around hair removal, unable to tolerate even the smallest sign of regrowth. They would spend hours examining their faces in polished metal mirrors, searching for any trace of hair that needed to be eliminated. This obsession often extended to other areas of the face and body, creating a cycle of self-harm that was socially encouraged and praised. Children were not exempt from this beauty standard. Young girls would have their eyebrows removed as soon as they showed signs of hair growth, often around age 10 or 11. This early introduction to painful beauty rituals was seen as necessary preparation for adult life. But it also meant that many women never experienced having natural eyebrows as adults. The economic impact of the eyebrow removal trend was substantial. Wealthy women employed specialists who claimed expertise in hair removal techniques, paying significant sums for treatments that were often no more effective than what they could do at home. The market for depilatory creams, specialized tools, and after-hour treatments created an entire industry devoted to helping women eliminate their eyebrows. Poor women who couldn't afford professional treatments often resorted to even more dangerous home remedies. They would mix their own chemical solutions using whatever toxic substances they could obtain, often with disastrous results. The lack of standardization or safety testing meant that these homemade treatments were essentially experiments performed on their own faces. The trend wasn't uniform across all social classes or regions. While noble women in major cities might have access to the latest eyebrow removal techniques, rural women often maintained more natural looks simply because they couldn't afford the time or resources required for constant hair removal. This created a visible class distinction. The wealthy could afford to look artificially smooth, while the poor were stuck with their natural peasant-like eyebrows. Interestingly, the no-eyebrow trend wasn't entirely consistent even among the upper classes. Some regions or time periods favored very thin eyebrows rather than complete removal, leading to a slightly less extreme but still unnatural appearance. These thin eyebrows were achieved through careful plucking that left just a few hairs, creating a barely there line that suggested eyebrows without actually having them. The religious implications of eyebrow removal were also significant. In Christian theology, the human body was considered God's creation, and deliberately altering it could be seen as vanity or even blasphemy. However, the social pressure to conform to beauty standards was so strong that most women were willing to risk spiritual condemnation for the sake of fashion. Some religious authorities did speak out against extreme beauty practices, including eyebrow removal, but their voices were largely ignored. The pursuit of beauty was seen as a woman's duty to her husband and family, and religious concerns were often secondary to social expectations. The medical consequences of constant eyebrow removal were severe and long-lasting. Many women developed chronic skin conditions in their brow area, including infections, scarring, and permanent discoloration. The repeated trauma to the hair follicles often resulted in permanent hair loss, meaning that even women who later wanted to grow their eyebrows back found themselves unable to do so. The psychological trauma of growing up without eyebrows also had lasting effects. Many women reported feeling incomplete or unnatural when they looked at their reflection. But they had been conditioned to believe that this artificial appearance was more beautiful than their natural state. This created a generation of women who were literally unable to recognize their own natural beauty. The tools and techniques used for eyebrow removal also evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated, but not necessarily safer. By the late medieval period, there were specialized instruments designed specifically for hair removal, including heated metal tools that could burn away hair more efficiently than crude methods. However, these improvements often led to more severe injuries and complications. The social pressure to maintain perfectly smooth brows was so intense that women would continue their hair removal routines even when they were ill, pregnant, or recovering from other medical procedures. The idea of appearing in public with visible eyebrow hair was considered so shameful that women would risk their health rather than be seen with natural facial hair. Some women became so skilled at eyebrow removal that they offered their services to others, creating an informal network of beauty specialists who traveled between households providing hair removal services. These women often guarded their techniques and recipes as trade secrets, passing them down through generations of practitioners. The end of the eyebrow removal trend came gradually as Renaissance ideals of natural beauty began to influence fashion. However, the transition was not immediate and many women continued to remove their eyebrows well into the 16th century. The return of eyebrows to fashion was actually controversial, with some people arguing that natural eyebrows were vulgar and unfashionable. Even today, we can see the lasting impact of medieval beauty standards in our own culture's complicated relationship with eyebrows. The constant plucking, waxing, threading, and shaping that modern women undergo echoes the medieval obsession with controlling and manipulating facial hair, though thankfully with less toxic chemicals and fewer life-threatening procedures. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was desirable, but like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of damnation involved. The ideal was a subtle blush, the kind that suggested you had just heard a mildly scandalous poem or stepped outdoors for exactly 30 seconds, but not long enough to develop a tan. Heaven forbid. A gentle rose hue on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and general survival, all things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the age of 28, which was already beating the odds in medieval times. But here's where it gets complicated. You couldn't look like you were trying. Applying rouge was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The Church was not amused by women smearing color on their faces, unless of course they were nobility or doing it humbly, which is a theological gray area that scholars are still trying to define. Still, women improvised with the dedication of scientists working on a cure for death. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even kochel, a deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, bugs, because beauty has never been kind to anyone, including the insects that died for it. The process of creating medieval rouge was an art form that would make modern cosmetic chemists weep. Women would crush berries or insects in small bowls, mix them with various binding agents like animal fat or plant oils, and create pastes that could be applied to the cheeks. The consistency was often unpredictable, sometimes too thick, sometimes too watery, always likely to stain everything it touched. Some women rubbed their cheeks vigorously to get that natural flush, essentially giving themselves mild bruises in the name of beauty. Others used mixtures of red ochre, a clay-based pigment, or wine sediment dabbed carefully to avoid detection by both clergy and judgmental neighbors. The goal was always to look naturally flushed, as if good health and virtue was simply radiating from within. For the wealthy, rouge could be made from more exotic and expensive ingredients. Red lead, despite its toxicity, was prized for its vibrant color and staying power. Cinnabar, a mercury-based mineral, provided a brilliant red hue that was both beautiful and deadly. These luxury cosmetics were often imported from distant lands, making them status symbols as much as beauty products. The application of rouge required skill and subtlety. Too little and you looked pale and sickly. Too much and you risked being compared to a prostitute. Or worse, a French courtier. The horror. The ideal application was so subtle that it appeared to be natural coloring enhanced perhaps by a brisk walk in the garden or a moment of modest embarrassment. Women developed various techniques for applying rouge without being obvious about it. Some would use their fingertips to blend the color into their skin, creating a natural-looking flush. Others used small pieces of cloth or even feathers to dab the color onto their cheeks. The most skilled practitioners could apply rouge so expertly that even close examination wouldn't reveal its artificial nature. The timing of rouge application was also crucial. It had to be applied fresh each day as most medieval cosmetics didn't have the staying power of modern makeup. This meant that women had to wake up early to complete their beauty routine before appearing in public, adding another layer of complexity to their daily lives. The social implications of wearing rouge were complex and contradictory. While a natural blush was considered beautiful and healthy, artificial coloring was often viewed with suspicion. Women had to walk a fine line between enhancing their natural beauty and appearing vain or immoral. The key was to make the enhancement look effortless and natural. Even though achieving this effect required considerable time and skill, religious authorities had mixed feelings about rouge. Some condemned it as vanity and deception, arguing that women should be content with the appearance God had given them. Others took a more moderate stance, suggesting that modest enhancement was acceptable as long as it didn't become an obsession or distract from spiritual matters. The quality of rouge varied dramatically depending on what a woman could afford. Wealthy ladies had access to finely ground pigments mixed with expensive oils and perfumes. Poor women made do with whatever they could find: crushed flowers, clay, even brick dust mixed with animal fat. The results were often unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. The health consequences of medieval rouge were significant but poorly understood at the time. Lead-based cosmetics caused gradual poisoning, leading to symptoms like fatigue, digestive problems, and neurological issues. Mercury-based products could cause tremors, tooth loss, and mental instability. Even seemingly innocent plant-based rouges could cause allergic reactions or skin damage. Many women developed chronic skin conditions from regular rouge use. The constant application and removal of cosmetics combined with the harsh ingredients used led to irritation, scarring, and premature aging. Ironically, the pursuit of youthful beauty often resulted in skin that looked older and more damaged than it would have naturally. The storage and preservation of rouge presented additional challenges. Without modern preservatives, cosmetics spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather. Women had to constantly make fresh batches of rouge, which was time-consuming and expensive. Spoiled cosmetics could cause serious skin infections or other health problems. The social pressure to wear rouge was intense, particularly among the upper classes. A woman who appeared in public without any color in her cheeks might be seen as ill, poor, or lacking in feminine virtue. This pressure led many women to take risks with dangerous cosmetics rather than face social disapproval. Children were often introduced to rouge at a young age, as mothers taught their daughters the art of subtle cosmetic application. This early exposure to potentially toxic substances may have contributed to health problems later in life. Though the connection wasn't understood at the time, The rouge trade became a significant part of the medieval economy. Merchants specialized in importing exotic pigments and ingredients for cosmetics. Skilled craftsmen made their living creating and selling rouge to wealthy clients. The demand for quality cosmetics drove innovation in chemistry and manufacturing techniques. Some regions developed reputations for producing superior rouge. Italian cosmetics were particularly prized for their quality and sophistication. French rouge was known for its subtle colors and smooth application. These regional specialties became luxury goods that were traded across Europe. The application of rouge also became a social ritual. Wealthy women would gather with their friends and servants to apply cosmetics together, sharing techniques and gossip. These beauty sessions served as important social bonding experiences and opportunities to display wealth and status. The tools used for rouge application were often works of art in themselves. Wealthy women owned elaborate cosmetic sets with ornate containers, brushes, and mirrors. These sets were often given as wedding gifts or passed down through generations as family heirlooms. The seasonal variation in rouge use reflected both practical and social considerations. In winter, when natural color was harder to maintain, rouge became more socially acceptable. In summer, when a natural flush was easier to achieve, artificial coloring was viewed with more suspicion. The decline of medieval rouge practices came gradually as Renaissance ideals of natural beauty began to influence fashion. However, the transition was slow and many women continued to use traditional rouge recipes well into the early modern period. The legacy of medieval cosmetics can still be seen in modern makeup practices, though thankfully with much safer ingredients and better understanding of health risks. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light or stolen from a bottle angel, you were already starting from behind in the beauty game. Blonde hair, in particular, was the medieval gold standard. Literally and figuratively, it was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and in case you needed divine backup, the Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde, even though she was geographically speaking almost certainly not. But realism was less important than radiance in medieval art and beauty standards. If you were born blonde, congratulations. You were considered blessed by God himself. And you probably got out of a few chores because people assumed you were too ethereal for manual labor. But natural blondness, like most good things in medieval life, didn't last forever. Hair darkened with age, and maintaining that celestial glow required intervention that was part chemistry, part prayer, and part willingness to risk your scalp for beauty. Medieval women took matters into their own hands, and sometimes into cauldrons. Homemade hair lightening concoctions were as varied as they were dangerous, including saffron, expensive but effective; chamomile, gentle but slow; ash, harsh but available; honey, sticky but nourishing; and lye, effective but likely to dissolve your hair entirely if you weren't careful. The most popular method was called sunbasking, which sounds relaxing, but was actually an endurance test that would make modern spa-goers weep. Women would apply their lightening mixture to their hair, then sit in the blazing sun for hours wearing special hats called solanas that had no tops. Essentially sun funnels designed to concentrate heat and light on their hair while protecting their precious pale faces. The solana was a wide-brimmed hat with the crown cut out, creating a sort of hair-exposing helmet that looked ridiculous, but served its purpose. Women would sit motionless for hours in the Italian or French sun, their hair soaking in whatever chemical mixture they'd applied, slowly baking in the heat like a very uncomfortable casserole. Some of the more adventurous hair lightening recipes included ingredients that would horrify modern chemists. Urine was a popular addition. And yes, we mean human urine, which was thought to help lift color from the hair. The ammonia content actually did have some bleaching properties, though the smell was apparently considered a small price to pay for golden locks. Other recipes called for sulfur, which could lighten hair, but also had the delightful side effect of making it smell like rotten eggs for weeks. Some women used mixtures containing mercury, lead, or other toxic metals, not understanding that they were slowly poisoning themselves through their scalp. The pursuit of beautiful hair often led to hair loss, scalp burns, and systemic poisoning. The process wasn't just about the chemicals. It was about endurance. Women would spend entire days in the sun, reapplying their mixtures every few hours, enduring headaches, sunstroke, and dehydration, all in the name of achieving the perfect shade of blonde. Some fainted from the heat. Others suffered severe sunburns on their scalp and face. But the social pressure to have light hair was so intense that these risks seemed acceptable. Hair texture mattered almost as much as color. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine waterfall of spun gold. But this luxury was reserved for unmarried women who were allowed to display their hair as a sign of their purity and availability. Once married, your golden mane was to be hidden under veils, nets, and head wraps because apparently the moment you said "I do," your hair became a national security risk. The rules around hair display were complex and strictly enforced. Unmarried girls could wear their hair loose during certain ceremonies or festivals. But even then it had to be properly arranged and adorned. Braids were acceptable for daily wear, but they had to be neat and modest. Any suggestion of wildness or abandon in a woman's hairstyle was considered scandalous and potentially immoral. For noble women, hair was often braided and twisted into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, precious beads, or intricate embroidery. Anything to remind observers that you didn't shear sheep for a living. The more complex your hairstyle, the more obvious it was that you had servants to help you achieve it, which was its own form of status symbol. The hair lightening process wasn't just physically demanding, it was also expensive. Saffron, one of the most effective natural lightening agents, was worth more than its weight in gold. A single hair treatment using high-quality saffron could cost more than a peasant family's monthly income. This made blonde hair not just a beauty standard, but a clear indicator of wealth and social status. Women who couldn't afford expensive ingredients often resorted to dangerous alternatives. They would collect ash from specific types of wood, believing that different trees produced different lightening effects. Oak ash was prized for its supposed ability to create golden tones, while birch ash was thought to produce a more silvery blonde. The reality was that most of these ashes were simply caustic substances that damaged hair and scalp alike. The preparation of hair lightening mixtures became a specialized skill passed down from mother to daughter. Recipes were closely guarded family secrets, with each household claiming to have the perfect formula for achieving the ideal shade. Some families employed servants whose sole job was to prepare and apply hair treatments, creating an entire domestic industry around hair lightening. The timing of hair treatments was crucial and often tied to religious or seasonal calendars. Many women believed that hair should only be lightened during certain phases of the moon or on specific saints' days for maximum effectiveness. This added a mystical element to the beauty routine and often meant that women had to wait weeks or months between treatments. The social implications of hair color extended beyond simple beauty standards. Blonde hair was associated with nobility and virtue, while dark hair was often linked to lower social status or moral questionability. This created a hierarchy where women with naturally light hair had social advantages, while those with dark hair faced subtle discrimination and pressure to lighten their locks. Men weren't entirely left out of the hair obsession, though their participation was more subtle. Thick golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art, with knights and nobles frequently depicted with flowing blonde hair. Some men did use mild lightening treatments, though they had to be careful not to appear too vain or feminine in their grooming habits. The health consequences of medieval hair lightening were severe and often permanent. The caustic chemicals used in many treatments caused chemical burns on the scalp, leading to scarring and permanent hair loss. Women who regularly used these treatments often developed chronic scalp conditions, including infections, inflammation, and painful sores that never fully healed. The psychological impact was also significant. Women became obsessed with maintaining their artificially lightened hair, spending enormous amounts of time and money on treatments that often made their hair brittle, thin, and prone to breaking. Many women experienced what we would now recognize as body dysmorphia, unable to see their natural beauty, and constantly dissatisfied with their appearance. The hair lightening industry also created opportunities for fraud and exploitation. Unscrupulous merchants sold fake or adulterated ingredients at premium prices, taking advantage of women's desperation to achieve the perfect hair color. Some treatments contained no active ingredients at all, while others were so harsh they caused immediate and severe damage. The storage and preservation of hair lightening ingredients presented additional challenges. Many of the substances used were unstable and could become more dangerous over time. Women often didn't understand the chemistry involved and would use expired or contaminated ingredients, leading to unpredictable and sometimes catastrophic results. The application process itself was often a social event. Wealthy women would gather with their friends and servants to apply hair treatments together, sharing gossip and advice while they waited for the chemicals to work. These sessions could last all day and often included elaborate meals and entertainment to pass the time. The tools used for hair lightening were primitive but ingenious. Special combs made from bone or wood were used to distribute treatments evenly through the hair. Brushes made from animal hair helped work the mixtures into every strand. Some women used heated metal tools to help activate the lightening agents, though this often resulted in burned hair and scalp injuries. The seasonal nature of hair lightening meant that women's hair color could vary dramatically throughout the year. Summer treatments in bright sunlight produced the most dramatic results, while winter applications were often less effective. This created a cycle where women's hair was lightest in the fall and gradually darkened through the winter months. The decline of extreme hair lightening practices came gradually as Renaissance ideals began to celebrate more natural beauty. However, the transition was slow and many women continued to use traditional lightening methods well into the early modern period. The legacy of medieval hair obsessions can still be seen in modern beauty culture, where blonde hair continues to be associated with youth, beauty, and desirability. The most tragic aspect of the medieval hair lightening obsession was how it affected young girls. Mothers would begin lightening their daughters' hair as early as age 10 or 12, starting a lifelong cycle of chemical treatments that often resulted in permanent damage. These girls grew up never knowing their natural hair color or texture, having been conditioned from childhood to believe that their natural appearance was inadequate. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off unless you were trying to get married. Then suddenly it became a strategic asset, carefully displayed and managed like a precious commodity. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose as a symbol of purity and innocence, though not too loose unless you were going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual saint or being martyred. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice. But once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations! You now had a husband and an obligation to wrap your locks tighter than a monastery's wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and coifs, a medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest. They were practical in ways that modern people might not appreciate. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and unsolicited compliments from troubadours. In a world where washing your hair was a major production that might happen once a month if you were lucky, keeping it covered was actually a form of hygiene management. The most dedicated women layered their coverings like they were preparing for Arctic exploration. A koi, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin. The effect was that you looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was exactly the goal. But fashion, being fashion, was rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, head coverings got more elaborate. more expensive, and more architecturally challenging. Nets were embroidered with gold thread that cost more than most people's annual income. Veils were starched into geometric shapes that defied both gravity and common sense. Some noble women wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and tiny bells. Because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head. The wimple, in particular, became an art form of concealment. This white linen cloth wrapped around the head and under the chin, completely hiding the hair and neck while framing the face in a way that was supposed to be both modest and flattering. The skill required to wrap a wimple properly was considerable. Too loose, and you looked sloppy. Too tight, and you couldn't move your head without the whole thing unraveling. Different regions developed their own styles of head covering, each with specific rules about how much hair could be shown, and under what circumstances. In some areas, married women could allow a small fringe of hair to show at the forehead. In others, even the slightest glimpse of hair was considered scandalous. These regional variations created a complex social code that women had to navigate carefully when traveling. The quality and style of head coverings also served as indicators of social status. Wealthy women wore veils made from the finest silk imported from distant lands and dyed with expensive pigments. Poor women made do with rough linen or wool, often dyed with whatever materials they could find locally. The difference was immediately apparent to anyone who knew what to look for. In many cultures, concealed hair was tied directly to morality and virtue. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous, while exposed hair on a married woman could get you compared to a lady of the night. Or worse, a French woman. The Church reinforced these ideas through sermons and religious art that consistently depicted virtuous women with covered heads and sinful women with loose flowing hair. The practical challenges of maintaining elaborate head coverings were significant. The fabrics had to be kept clean and properly starched, which required considerable time and effort. The pins and fastenings used to hold everything in place were often made from precious metals and could be quite valuable. Losing a veil pin could be a minor financial disaster for a middle-class family. Some women rebelled against the strict hair covering rules in subtle ways. They would let a little curl slip out accidentally or wear translucent veils that technically counted as covered while still allowing glimpses of their carefully maintained hair. These small acts of defiance required considerable skill to pull off without attracting unwanted attention from religious authorities or disapproving neighbors. The seasonal challenges of head covering were also significant. In summer, multiple layers of fabric around the head and neck could be stifling and uncomfortable. In winter, the coverings provided welcome warmth, but could become heavy and cumbersome when wet from snow or rain. Women had to balance modesty requirements with practical comfort, often choosing to suffer rather than risk social disapproval. The process of putting on elaborate head coverings often required assistance from servants or family members. This created a daily ritual that could take an hour or more depending on the complexity of the style. For wealthy women, this was part of their morning routine, but for working women, it represented time that could have been spent on other necessary tasks. The psychological impact of constant hair covering was profound. Many women spent their entire adult lives with their hair hidden from public view, never experiencing the simple pleasure of feeling wind in their hair or sun on their scalp. This enforced concealment created a sense that their natural appearance was somehow shameful or inappropriate. Children learned the rules of hair covering from an early age. Young girls would practice wrapping veils and wimples, preparing for the day when they would be required to cover their hair completely. This early training reinforced the idea that a woman's hair was something private and potentially dangerous that needed to be carefully controlled and concealed. The economic impact of the head covering industry was substantial. Entire guilds were devoted to producing veils, wimples, and other head coverings. Skilled seamstresses specialized in creating elaborate headdresses for wealthy clients. The demand for quality head coverings drove innovation in textile production and design. The religious significance of hair covering extended beyond simple modesty. In Christian theology, a woman's covered head was seen as a sign of her submission to God and her husband. This religious justification made it nearly impossible for women to challenge the practice without appearing to challenge religious authority itself. The decline of extreme hair covering practices came gradually as Renaissance ideals began to influence fashion. However, the transition was uneven, with some regions maintaining strict covering requirements well into the early modern period. The legacy of medieval hair covering can still be seen in various religious and cultural traditions that continue to require women to cover their hair in certain contexts. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your legs or your overall height. We're talking about your hat. By the 15th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance. The hennon. You know the one. Those towering cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples and had very strong opinions about defying gravity. The hennon wasn't just headwear. It was a social ladder you wore on your head. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet in height, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennon, the higher your status, and the more doors you smacked into on your way to dinner. It was medieval architecture made wearable, a Gothic cathedral perched precariously on your skull, often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade. Hennons were structured with wireframes that gave them their dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles, doorways, or the elaborate headdresses of other women trying to navigate the same narrow castle corridors. The construction of a proper hennon was an engineering marvel that would have impressed medieval cathedral builders. The wireframe had to be strong enough to maintain the cone shape while light enough not to break the wearer's neck. The fabric had to be stretched taut over the frame without wrinkles or sags. The veil had to be attached securely enough not to fall off during normal activities, but delicately enough to flutter attractively in the slightest breeze. Getting your hair to fit under one of these architectural marvels was an art form in itself. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. Remember our earlier discussion about forehead real estate to help the hen sit properly. The process could take hours and often required the assistance of multiple servants who specialized in hennon management. Comfort was not part of the design brief. Wearing a hennon was like balancing a small tower on your head while trying to go about your daily business. The weight distribution was terrible. The balance was precarious and the height made it nearly impossible to go through doorways without ducking or turning sideways. Many castles had to modify their architecture to accommodate the hennon trend, raising doorways and ceiling heights in areas where fashionable ladies congregated. But hennons weren't the only vertical obsession in medieval headwear. Some women wore heart-shaped escafons, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hennons, where veils were spread out like wings. These styles were great for making dramatic entrances, but terrible for anything involving wind, rain, or the need to move quickly through crowds. The butterfly hennon, in particular, was a masterpiece of impracticality. The wire framework extended horizontally from the head, supporting veils that could span several feet on either side. Women wearing these contraptions had to turn sideways to fit through doorways and couldn't sit in chairs with backs. They were essentially wearing architectural installations as fashion accessories. Outside of the nobility, most women stuck with more practical head coverings, veils, linen caps, or surlets that didn't require structural engineering degrees to wear safely. These simpler styles were less dangerous, more affordable, and significantly less likely to be mistaken for siege weapons. But they also marked you clearly as someone who couldn't afford to wear a small building on your head. The social pressure to wear increasingly elaborate headwear was intense. At court functions, women competed to have the most impressive headdress, leading to an arms race of height and complexity. Some hennons became so tall that they had to be supported by additional framework attached to the shoulders. essentially turning the wearer into a walking architectural display. The practical challenges of daily life while wearing a henna were numerous and often comical. Eating required careful planning to avoid knocking over serving dishes with your headwear. Dancing was a carefully choreographed affair where partners had to maintain safe distances to avoid entangling their respective headdresses. Even simple conversations required strategic positioning to prevent accidental hat collisions. Clergy and conservative thinkers, as expected, were less than enthused about the henna trend. They warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Religious authorities preached against the pride and worldliness represented by towering headdresses, arguing that they distracted from spiritual contemplation and encouraged competitive materialism among women. The economic impact of the hen fashion was substantial. The materials required, fine fabrics, wire, precious metals for decoration, were expensive and often imported from distant regions. Skilled craftspeople specialized in henna construction, creating an entire industry devoted to producing increasingly elaborate headwear. The cost of a single high-quality henna could equal several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. The maintenance requirements for hennas were also significant. The wireframes could bend or break, requiring skilled repair. The fabrics needed regular cleaning and maintenance to keep their appearance. The veils had to be replaced periodically as they became damaged or worn. For wealthy women, maintaining their henna collection was a significant ongoing expense. Travel while wearing a henna presented unique challenges. Special arrangements had to be made for transportation as standard carriages and litters weren't designed to accommodate 2-foot-tall headdresses. Some women had custom vehicles built with higher roofs, specifically to accommodate their fashionable headwear. The decline of the henna came gradually as Renaissance ideals began to favor more natural and classical styles. However, the transition wasn't immediate, and some regions continued to embrace towering headwear well into the 16th century. The legacy of medieval vertical fashion can still be seen in various ceremonial and religious contexts where elaborate headdresses continue to symbolize status and authority. The most dangerous aspect of hen wearing wasn't the social pressure or the expense. It was the very real physical risk. The height and weight of these headdresses put enormous strain on the neck and spine. Many women developed chronic neck problems, headaches, and posture issues from years of wearing heavy, unbalanced headwear. Some suffered serious injuries when their hennas caught on low-hanging objects or when they lost their balance due to the top-heavy weight distribution. Fire was another constant hazard. The combination of tall fabric-covered structures and medieval lighting, candles, torches, and open fires created numerous opportunities for disaster. Historical records document several incidents of women's headdresses catching fire, sometimes with fatal results. The veils that cascaded from hennas were particularly vulnerable to ignition, and once they caught fire, the flames could spread quickly to the wearer's hair and clothing. Weather presented additional challenges that henna wearers had to navigate carefully. Wind could turn a graceful veil into a dangerous whip, or cause the entire headdress to act like a sail, potentially knocking the wearer off balance. Rain could soak the fabric, making the henna even heavier and more unwieldy. Snow and ice created slipping hazards that were magnified by the altered center of gravity that came with wearing a tower on your head. The social etiquette surrounding hennas was complex and strictly observed. There were rules about when and where different styles could be worn, how to greet someone while wearing a henna without causing injury, and proper protocols for navigating crowded spaces. Women had to learn an entirely new set of social skills to function gracefully while wearing these architectural marvels. Children of henna-wearing mothers often had to adapt their behavior as well. They learned to approach their mothers from specific angles to avoid being struck by protruding wireframes or flowing veils. Family interactions became more formal and distant as casual physical affection was difficult when one party was wearing a potentially dangerous headdress. The psychological impact of wearing hennas was significant but rarely discussed. The constant awareness of the towering structure on one's head, the need to move carefully and deliberately, and the social pressure to maintain perfect posture and grace created a state of perpetual tension. Many women reported feeling like they were performing rather than simply living when wearing their most elaborate headdresses. The regional variations in henna styles reflected local tastes, available materials, and cultural influences. French hennons tended to be taller and more pointed, reflecting the Gothic architectural preferences of the region. Italian versions were often more rounded and decorated with classical motifs. English hennons were generally more modest in height, but elaborately decorated with embroidery and jewels. The decline of the henna trend was hastened by several factors beyond changing fashion preferences. The practical difficulties of wearing such elaborate headwear became increasingly apparent as urban environments became more crowded and complex. The economic burden of maintaining henna wardrobes became unsustainable for many families as other luxury goods competed for their attention and resources. The rise of humanism and Renaissance ideals also contributed to the hennon's downfall. The new emphasis on natural beauty and classical proportions made the artificial height and geometric shapes of hennons seem outdated and excessive. Artists and writers began to celebrate more natural hairstyles and simpler head coverings, influencing public opinion against the towering fashion. Military conflicts and political instability in the late 15th century also played a role in ending the henna era. The practical demands of wartime and economic uncertainty made elaborate fashion statements seem frivolous and inappropriate. Women needed to be more mobile and practical in their dress, which was incompatible with wearing architectural structures on their heads. The legacy of the henna extends beyond fashion history into our understanding of how beauty standards can become extreme and potentially dangerous. The willingness of medieval women to endure physical discomfort, financial hardship, and social pressure to conform to an arbitrary standard of beauty reflects patterns that continue to influence fashion and beauty culture today. Modern fashion occasionally references the henna in avant-garde designs and theatrical costumes. But these contemporary interpretations are typically worn for brief periods and in controlled environments. The idea of wearing a 2-foot-tall cone on one's head for daily activities seems absurd to modern sensibilities. Yet, it was once considered the height of feminine elegance and sophistication. The economic impact of oral care was significant for those who could afford it. Imported spices, specialized tools, and professional treatments were expensive luxuries that only the wealthy could access regularly. For the majority of the population, oral care consisted of whatever free or cheap remedies they could devise from locally available materials. The social consequences of poor oral health extended beyond simple embarrassment. Bad breath could affect marriage prospects, business relationships, and social standing. In a society where personal relationships were crucial for survival and advancement, oral health problems could have serious long-term consequences for an individual's life prospects. The decline of medieval oral care practices came gradually as new understanding of dental health and improved tools became available. However, the transition was slow and many traditional practices persisted well into the early modern period. The legacy of medieval oral care can still be seen in various folk remedies and traditional practices that continue to be used in some parts of the world. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps and Instagram followers. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, like spices or peasant revolts. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. And teeth were important. Yes, but more for chewing bread than charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying. Especially by age 30, so, the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence or lack of caring. Tooth decay was rampant thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge, and meat, and lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe. But even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing compounds that medieval mouths were ill-equipped to handle. Also, Dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism performed with pliers. There were no anesthetics, no understanding of sterile technique, and no gentle dental hygienists to make you feel comfortable. If you had a toothache, your options were to live with it, drink yourself into unconsciousness, or have someone yank the offending tooth out with whatever metal tool was handy while you screamed into a leather strap. Despite this grim reality, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were rare and seen as a mark of youth, good fortune, and perhaps divine intervention. But people weren't going around flashing big, toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a demure closed-lip smile was far more fashionable and socially acceptable. The ideal medieval smile was subtle and mysterious. Think, I might be contemplating a sonnet, rather than, I'm thrilled to be here. Open-mouthed laughter was considered vulgar and inappropriate, especially for women, who were expected to maintain dignity and composure at all times. A gentle closed-lip smile suggested refinement, while a broad grin suggested you might be simple-minded, or worse, drunk. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to try to clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best. The goal wasn't necessarily to achieve Hollywood white teeth, but rather to remove the worst of the staining and decay that made smiling a social hazard. But overall, teeth were tolerated rather than flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels usually keep their mouths politely closed as if they too were quietly aware of the risks of showing their dental work. The famous enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa painted during the Renaissance reflects this medieval tradition of subtle closed-mouth expressions. The few dental care practices that did exist were often more harmful than helpful. People would rub their teeth with rough cloths, sometimes soaked in wine or vinegar, which could remove some surface stains, but also wore away protective enamel. Others used mixtures of honey and herbs, which might have had some antibacterial properties, but also fed the very bacteria that caused tooth decay. The wealthy had access to slightly better dental care, including specialized tooth cleaning servants and imported dental tools. However, even the best medieval dental care was primitive by modern standards. The concept of preventive dentistry didn't exist. People only sought treatment when they were already in severe pain, by which point the damage was usually irreversible. The social implications of dental problems were significant, but rarely discussed openly. Bad teeth could affect marriage prospects, as they were seen as signs of poor health, low social status, or moral failing. However, since dental problems were so common, there was also a certain acceptance of dental imperfection as a normal part of life. The pain management techniques available for dental problems were limited and often ineffective. Herbal remedies like clove oil could provide temporary relief, but serious dental infections often led to systemic illness and death. The lack of antibiotics meant that what we would consider minor dental problems could become life-threatening conditions. The tools used for dental care were primitive and often dangerous. Metal picks and scrapers could cause serious injuries to the gums and teeth. The lack of understanding about bacterial infections meant that these tools were rarely cleaned properly, leading to the spread of infections and diseases. The regional variations in dental care practices reflected local customs, available materials, and cultural beliefs. Some regions had traditions of using specific plants or minerals for dental care, while others relied more heavily on religious or magical remedies. These variations created a patchwork of dental care practices across medieval Europe. The economic aspects of dental care were significant for those who could afford professional treatment. Barber surgeons who provided most dental services charged substantial fees for tooth extractions and other procedures. The cost of dental care often meant that people delayed treatment until their conditions became unbearable. The religious implications of dental care were complex and sometimes contradictory. Some religious authorities viewed excessive attention to dental appearance as vanity, while others argued that maintaining one's health was a religious duty. This theological debate influenced how people approached dental care and whether they sought treatment for dental problems. The decline of medieval dental practices came gradually as new understanding of dental health and improved techniques became available. However, the transition was slow and many traditional practices persisted well into the early modern period. The legacy of medieval dental care can still be seen in various folk remedies and traditional practices that continue to be used in some parts of the world. Men weren't immune to dental problems either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline. But no ballad ever included the line, "His murs gleamed like ivory in the moonlight." There's a reason troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and bite alignment. The reality of medieval dental health was simply too grim to romanticize. Even in an age that romanticized everything from warfare to religious suffering. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were oddly specific and surprisingly demanding. You didn't need to be chiseled like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a haycart after a 3-day bender. The sweet spot was somewhere between ready to joust and could write a poem about jousting without actually having to do it. The ideal medieval man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and very importantly, nobly unbothered by the concerns of common folk. Not overly muscular, mind you, because that suggested manual labor, but not soft either, because that suggested laziness or too much me. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword with deadly precision. But only if your squire was busy, and the situation absolutely demanded it. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive features that suggested good breeding and noble blood. Think prince in an illuminated manuscript rather than village strongman who can lift a cart. The goal was aristocratic refinement, not brute strength. Though a certain amount of physical capability was expected for practical reasons like not dying in combat. A well-groomed beard or a smooth, clean-shaven face was acceptable, depending on the region, era, and current fashion trends. But either way, it needed to look intentional and carefully maintained, not like you'd been lost in the woods for a week surviving on berries and questionable mushrooms. Facial hair was a statement about your social status, personal hygiene, and attention to detail. Hair was typically shoulder length and styled, especially for noblemen who had the time and resources to maintain elaborate grooming routines. Curls were particularly fashionable in many courts, especially if they occurred naturally or looked like they did. Some men even used primitive curling techniques. Yes, really, including small heated rods or herbal rinses to enhance their natural texture and add shine to their locks. Because nothing said, "I'm above manual labor" quite like spending 45 minutes having your personal grooming assistant style your hair into perfect ringlets while you discussed philosophy or planned your next hunting expedition. The more time and effort your appearance required, the more obvious it was that you didn't need to work for a living. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the male silhouette and creating the ideal masculine appearance. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics helped create the desired body shape, with extra emphasis on posture and bearing. A nobleman didn't slouch or shuffle. He glided through castle halls with a hint of disdain and the confidence that came from never having to wonder where his next meal was coming from. And if a man did happen to be naturally muscular from training for combat or other noble pursuits, that was fine as long as he wasn't caught actually working with those muscles in any capacity that suggested employment. Fighting in wars was acceptable and even admirable. Hauling barrels in a tavern was not. The distinction was crucial for maintaining social status. Above all, the ideal medieval male look was supposed to appear effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born noble, well-bred, and naturally superior to common folk. And that inherent superiority, that divine right of good genetics and social position, was what made you appealing. It was the medieval version of hot without trying, except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land, titles, and a falcon. The grooming routines required to achieve this effortless look were actually quite elaborate and time-consuming. Men of the upper classes employed personal servants whose primary job was maintaining their master's appearance. These servants, often called valets or grooms of the chamber, were skilled in hairstyling, beard trimming, clothing maintenance, and the application of various cosmetic preparations. The cosmetic preparations used by medieval men were more extensive than many people realize. Skincare routines included the use of various oils, balms, and even light powders to maintain a refined complexion. The goal was to look healthy and well-maintained without appearing to use cosmetics, which required considerable skill and high-quality products. The seasonal challenges of maintaining the ideal male appearance were significant. In winter, the combination of cold weather and indoor fires could cause skin problems, while summer heat and outdoor activities could lead to unwanted tanning or weathering. Men had to adapt their grooming routines to maintain their refined appearance year-round.